I saw sparks. Am I too early for karaoke? All right, good morning ladies and gentlemen. How are you guys holding up? I see more people than before, which is surprising considering the crappy weather. But then, I guess the beach becomes less tempting on a day like this. Could anybody tell me whose idea it was to make a campus directly next to the ocean? I mean, sure, the view is nice, but it really makes you think, how am I still here in this classroom? Well, in case you were at the beach for the past few weeks, let's make a small recap of what we've seen so far. In the first week, I got all philosophical on you and started pondering on the importance of perception. Good times, always too short, because then things got more serious as we approached the methodology of the science. What exactly are we studying when we study the psychology of perception? If that's still unclear to you, I think they're putting the classes online. But look, it's simple. There are three entities: a stimulation, a nervous system, and the perception. Turns out, you gotta study all three to make correlations that mean something. I then proceeded to give a historical outlook of the study of the relationship between the stimulation and the perception, which made us talk about the German psychophysics from the late 19th century. Talked about them, talked about their conclusions, but especially talked about their influential positivist methods. Last week we had a pretty big class where we explored the historical progression toward an understanding of our own brains. We even talked about how neurons work and transmit their information. That was fun. Finally, we saw a few important neuroimaging techniques and how they ranked for their temporal and spatial resolutions. It's always a compromise, and that includes other important factors such as affordability and portability. Now, my Padawans, this was all prep work. It was all stage setting to finally attack the bursting heart of the subject, the tender meat of the matter, the chewy center of the brownie. But where shall we begin? Any preferences? Just kidding. Of course we're starting with vision. Are you kidding?